Weirdos is a 1999 Canadian animated series that, for a short window of time, was actually considered as lost media for a while. The first time that I've ever heard about this show was way back when I was younger. I frequently watched videos by a content creator named Blame It on George, given that I was fascinated with the concept of lost media. Among a lot of the topics that he discussed, one of them that I heard about repeatedly, since I watched his same videos a lot, was weirdos. For a while at the time, only 5 episodes were found, with one being incomplete, up until March of 2016 when all of the show's episodes were found. Apparently, the episodes were extremely hard to come by because of limited production, and when YTV released the full series on DVD, they only allowed the releases to be in Canada and that's it. And putting all cards on the table, and full disclosure, I by all means necessary am not saying that the show deserved to stay lost. I am an advocate for preserving all types of media, unless it's something like Cuties, which should stay in the realm of lost media / obscurity permanently. But Weirdos, at least the TV show, is bad. And I mean really, really bad. In my Sean's Network Reviews ranking, would I go so far as to say that Weirdos is the absolute worst show that I reviewed so far? Absolutely not. Especially since the shows that are in my top 4 as of episode 38 in production order do things that go beyond having the issues that this show has in specific. Even Family Dog, another 90s cartoon, is far worse than this show, but in my list of the worst cartoons of the 1990s, this one is pretty high up there, I guarantee it. And to start off my issues regarding this show, let's start off with the animation. I don't want to be too harsh on this show's visuals because, as I stated during my review on Rayman the Animated Series, this is a 90s cartoon, and those behind the show are still trying to get used to the technology, which does give this show a bit more of an excuse than some of the other shows I reviewed, especially Middle School Moguls, Power Players, and Camp Coral. But to be completely honest about the animation in this show, the show's animation is not good even by 1990s standards. To get a good grasp about what I think the show was trying to go for, I did some research regarding Weirdos and what it originally was. The original illustrations and toys had this very grungy Rob Zombie look to it that is very interesting to look at. They're so good that SpongeBob in particular has been recently referencing these crazy expressions that the original toys had, though they're more of a Ratfink reference, but you know what I mean. And considering the fact that this show was released in the 1990s, they presumably wanted this show as yet another Ren and Stimpy clone because of course it is. However, when they transported these designs over to computer animation, now the show looks very ugly, but at the same time, they kind of made them look too squeaky clean, so the nuances that came with the original illustrations are completely gone now, and the animation itself doesn't even make up for how unappealing that the designs are, because in spite of the fact that the show was released in the 90s, where computer animation was still being developed and was in its infancy by the time of this show's release, the show tries to pull off slapstick that is very poorly timed, and they also do animation techniques that look uncanny when you try to pull them off in 3D, like stretching the characters' necks out, wild takes, and they often skip frames altogether, especially when it comes to Killer. And while I do give the show some slack when it comes to its visuals, which didn't age well, there are times when they often get lazy with the backgrounds, where they loop the exact same sky animation, and the show implies that the characters live in a small town near the desert, but it's pretty desolate for a small town that is supposed to be in a desert. But as I stated before in other reviews, the animation is not what makes a series, it's the writing that makes a series what it is. And you know, I was willing to give this show a chance, in spite of how not good that the visuals are in this series. I mean, Kappa Mikey is a pretty good show, even though the animation is really not good in that series either. So I thought that going in, the show was going to subvert my expectations and at least be one of the more average or in the middle 90s cartoons, but what I got instead is a show that would definitely be a candidate for my personal worst cartoons of the 1990s list. What is the issue that I have with this show? Well, you know how a lot of people have said that they don't like a show such as Ed, Edd n Eddy for how mean-spirited it is, and how unlikable the characters are, most notably with Phantom Strider saying that the show is bad solely based on these elements.
I cannot understand what people like about this cartoon. At all. I think it's terrible in every way.
Something which I heavily disagree about. That's the problem that Weirdos has. In other reviews of mine, I made note about certain shows being either mean-spirited or having unlikable characters, but I glossed over the other characters that are not as bad, because something to emphasize is that being bland is not the same thing as being likable or interesting. But if there's something that I could at least give Ollie's Pack and The Adventures of Bernie some credit for, those two shows had a tiny handful of characters that were somewhat tolerable. That doesn't make them good characters, which I have to say because that's a defense that I've gotten real sick of, but they were at the very least not a jerk. Same thing even applies to shows that I find worse than Weirdos, such as Family Dog and Robot Boy. But I am not exaggerating this time when I say that there is not a single character in Weirdos that is remotely likable at all, nor are they even interesting. It gets up to the point where Wade, the character that this show actively wants you to hate, is more likable than most of the characters in this show. You could say that the parents, Daddy-O and Mama B, are likable because they do the least jerky things throughout the series. Both of them are the stereotypical animation parents that are extremely oblivious to what their children do, and they're so permissive throughout most of the show that they just remind me of Caillou's parents from the show of the same name, while everyone else has at least one specific thing that they do in an episode to remind you the question that you'd be wondering about while watching the show: who are we even supposed to be rooting for in this show? If there's something that you could give Ed, Edd n Eddy some props for, yes, that show had several characters that were incredibly unlikable towards each other, but with the exception of Naz, who was just there to be a love interest for the other male characters, they at least had personalities, and the show at least had funny quips from the other characters to make up for it. With Weirdos, what else is there to the show besides failed attempts at slapstick and cruelty? Short answer, there is none. Digger and Eddie have zero personalities whatsoever, basically being nothing but frat boy stereotypes of what people think that guys are like. And no joke, they both act exactly like how SpongeBob and Patrick did in season 6 to 8 of that show, basically being public nuisances more often than not. But I'd argue that even SpongeBob and Patrick during that era of the show still had a rare handful of moments where they can be legitimately likable, like Patrick with No Hat for Pat, or SpongeBob with Overbooked. And I say that they're public nuisances because there are multiple episodes where they just make things worse, like the generic babysitting episode where both of them just let the baby out of their sight, basically disregarding what Portia just told them in a previous scene. In the episode where Portia gets Wade's bodyguard away from him for her own selfish gains, where they basically antagonize Wade to the point where he goes back to the restaurant in an attempt to get him back. But the worst part is that these are how they are at their best. At their worst, they're constantly doing awful things to their sister and even their own parents, and very rarely do they ever get punished for what they do, like in Daddy Dismiss, for example. On the surface of things, the episode is your typical child has a crush on his teacher that is too old for them storyline, but what Digger decides to pull in this episode is unacceptable, because he decides to pretend to be the superintendent, specifically so that the substitute teacher would stay their teacher.
Our auto shop teacher is resigning tomorrow, and she's got the job.
The superintendent will be thrilled to hear that, Louie. Have a nice day.
And just when Digger was about to get punished at the end, the episode backtracks on this at the last second, and ends on a joke where the substitute teacher is now the vice principal, and she gets bubblegum on Leaky Boat Louie's face. The only other times in which these two get some form of punishment for their antics are Diary of a Mad Sister, the turbocharged theatrical tragedy, and Head Gasket of the Class. But that's 3 episode segments out of 25 that are currently available. Also, Digger is voiced by Kathleen Barr, using the exact same voice that she used for Kevin from Ed, Edd n Eddy, so the Ed, Edd n Eddy comparisons aren't even just something that I'm pulling out of my butt. Portia is basically the Squidward of this show, basically being the pessimistic one that the show constantly beats down on more often than not, and just like with the main problem that I have with this show, the series doesn't know whether I should feel sorry for or absolutely hate her. I mean, in Getting Over Davy, the episode decides to have a horrible showcase of therapy and getting the person to feel more at ease, by specifically badgering Portia to stop thinking about her crush 24/7,
Oh, Are you thinking about Davy?
No!
Are you thinking about Davy?
No!
Are you thinking about Davy?
No!
Look, there's Davy.
Where?
Penalty fine.
Not realizing that all this is going to do is make the person relapse into thinking about them again.
You bet. I love Davy. Love Davy. Davy.
And that there are other solutions to get her to stop thinking about him. But then in other episodes, there are more reminders as to why I don't feel sorry for her or anyone else whenever they get trucked over. And Leaky Boat Louie is just the dollar store version of the red guy from Cow and Chicken, and you can't convince me otherwise. Not only does he appear literally everywhere throughout the series and takes on so many jobs, but he seems to specifically go after Eddie, Digger, and Portia throughout the series. But he's not even entertaining in the slightest, and in all honesty, he's just a character that I dislike, especially considering the fact that he constantly implies that he wants to do physical harm to Digger through things that were accidental at worst. He literally decides to chase after Digger because he accidentally threw a newspaper at his head.
I'll put you in the obituaries. Get back here. I'm gonna recycle you.
Making me wish that I was watching Cow and Chicken instead of this show. And even some of the characters that don't seem like they'd be that bad have a nasty revelation up their sleeves to make me not like them either. Like Uncle Huey, who has an episode that implies that he overworks his pet alligator, or the pet in particular, who doesn't care a single bit about Uncle Huey's family at all, considering the fact that he literally chases Eddie and Digger out of the swamp before he could list the final ingredient to the fuel that both of them needed.
Add what? Wake up, Uncle Huey! You've got to tell me! But carry on! I've got to wake him up and ask him a question!
Don't look at me! Maybe I said something about his mother!
And in spite of the fact that this show has animation that tries way too hard, and giving off the feeling that it's trying to be like Ren and Stimpy, this show still plays things extremely safe, to the point where the animation and art style just does not fit the show in the slightest. Because when going into this show, you'd expect that this show would be more extreme or showcase more of the racing aspect that the intro set up. But it's just false advertisement because the show is not extreme at all. The show acts like your typical animated sitcom that also does things in too much of a mundane manner. And the show feels so squeaky clean in its content to the point where it pales in comparison to its temporaries, like Ren and Stimpy, Animaniacs, Rocko's Modern Life, Cow and Chicken, Ed, Ed and Eddy, and heck, even Schnookums and Meat plays things safe less than this show does, so at best, the show is incredibly boring to the point where, much like Power Players, I ended up having to take breaks in between because of how bland that the show was being for me. But when truly looking back at this show and what it gave me, usually in Sean's network reviews, I don't have a reason to really do a review on an individual episode of any show I reviewed so far, unless the episode does something uniquely horrendous that warrants a review, like Lost Sword from Thundercats Roar or Foot Brawl from Robot Boy, mainly because I'd already thoroughly covered what's wrong with it during the review. But in all honesty, this is one of those shows that I might end up having to come back to at a later date to cover at least one of its episodes because of how surprisingly mean it gets. Whether if it's the episode that dunks on Digger because he forgot Eddie's birthday was the next day and fails to make money through any sort of job, and Eddie gives him the silent treatment because he was avoiding him even though he was trying to keep the present a surprise. The episode where Portia takes Killer away from Wade and we're supposed to be rooting for her despite the fact that she was doing it for an incredibly selfish reason. The episode that is a horrible showcase of therapy and mental health. Or this one's my favorite episode of the show. There's an episode where Uncle Huey is counting on Eddie to honor their family's legacy, and because of forced writing, Uncle Huey goes into a coma before Eddie and Digger could find out what the formula for the racing fuel is, despite the fact that he's counting on Eddie to win, leading his jerk of a pet to essentially chase them out of the swamp, leaving Eddie to basically get unnecessarily stressed out for a majority of the episode. And the last part of the formula is only found out near the end, and it turns out that in order to get the fuel to work, they needed sweat. But, Only time can tell. As for shows being reviewed in Sean's network reviews, this one is close to the bottom. It's probably going to be in my top 10 worst shows I reviewed so far. That is if I don't come across 6 other shows down the road that would top it. It's not as bad as Family Dog due to that show's subject matter, nor even Mega Babies because it's way more obnoxious and puke-inducing than this show, but I honestly didn't expect this show to be as bad as it is. I thought that this would have been at least average or tolerable, especially in comparison to some of the other bad 90s cartoons. But no, not only is this show bad, it's honestly no different than the other 90s cartoons that tried to be Ren and Stimpy, but I'd argue that this one is worse than a majority of them. And considering the fact that production order-wise, we're only 38 episodes in, and there's still a lot of them on my binge list to get through, that's really saying a lot.